Now, inflammation can go haywire under lots of conditions, and we actually now have scientists creating a terminology called inflammaging, where chronic accumulation of inflammatory mediators on the cells of inflammation are destructive. Hi, I'm Dr. Bob Hariri from Piloting Health, and today we're going to talk about the 4 pillars of healthy aging. These are the tenets that I have been prescribing to for many, many years, where I believe that every year of life you add is worth living if you can preserve high performance mobility, high performance cognitive function, high performance immunity, and youthful aesthetics. When I present this, I want to also use this as an opportunity to connect the dots. How we actually, from everything we've learned in cellular biology and cellular medicine and regenerative medicine, how those teachings allow us to connect the dots so we create a clinical rationale for why we use those tools to preserve those functions. And I think I'll be able to make it clear to everyone that the future is really bright because we have at our disposal today access to some of the most powerful biological tools that nature has created and preserve those important functions that make every extra year we can add worth living. And so these 4 pillars, if you focus on them and you have a solution that can address all of them, that's, in my mind, the most efficient way to address the ravages of aging. So let's break it down a little bit. So high performance mobility. So we know that as we get older, 2 fundamental parts of our mobility system, if you will, the skeletal muscle tissue, which generates force, and the skeletal and joint system, which gives you the control of your extremities and so on and so forth. Those 2 systems start to degrade over time. We know that muscle tissue declines in quantity and quality with age. That's a condition called sarcopenia. And sarcopenia, or muscle loss, is kind of an inevitability as we age. There's some estimates that from as early as your mid-20s on, you can lose as much as 1% of your lean muscle mass every year, but it's a slow, insidious process, so we often don't notice it. And even when you take steps to prevent that, like exercise, good nutrition, and so on, it's a process that's somewhat hard to combat. So declining muscle mass and function and strength is associated with declining mobility. And then as your joints begin to wear out, the cartilage, the covering, if you will, of the opposing bones that form a joint, when that covering starts to wear out and become inflamed, you get the symptoms of degenerative arthritis that affects mobility. Both of these conditions appear to be associated with a declining functionality of the stem cells necessary to effectuate a repair and replacement of muscle or joint tissue. And so it's, in my mind, it's a pretty obvious connect the dots to say that if I'm developing osteoarthritis because of my age, and in part that might be due to a declining availability of stem cells to remodel my joints, maybe extra stem cells or the byproducts of the cells can help address those problems. These are areas we're very interested in developing additional expertise and be able to deploy these therapeutics in these settings. When it comes to muscle tissue, the same thing applies. If we know that by the time you reach 60, your lean muscle mass may be down by 30%, and mass alone may not be the only reason why the function declines. There may be that as you lose healthy muscle tissue, it's replaced by the effect of basically scar tissue, either fatty infiltration or fibrous infiltration. Anything I can do to preserve healthy muscle cells, muscle tissue, is going to allow me to preserve the functionality of that muscle. And again, there's another example of a place where we think cell therapy can play a very important role. So right there, maintaining high performance mobility, we believe can be addressed with cellular therapeutic approaches that restore the quantity of stem cells able to remodel and renew those tissues and respond to things like inflammation to both control those deleterious inflammatory processes which cause pain and so on and so forth and are destructive, and actually can stimulate the normal remodeling of the cartilage and joints so that joints function, muscle functions, mobility is restored. Let's now sidestep to the next important area, which is high performance cognitive function. So we're all worried about declining brain performance with age. Look, I got to tell you, I just turned 65, and I worry about the fact that I find it really hard sometimes to remember where my keys are. I'll read an entire book or paper, and the next day I forget what I even read. Is that an inevitability, or is there some way to combat that? So declining cognitive function is related to lots of complicated interactions between the brain and the system that connects the brain to the rest of the body. Now, there's no doubt, and I've actually convinced myself of this. Part of the reason why time seems to be going by faster and faster and faster as we age. It used to be that when we were young, you thought it took forever to get from beginning of the year to Christmas. Now it seems like you turn the calendar and before you know it, the holidays are upon us. I've always said that that's in part because of the frame of reference we have, right? As we age, today is a much smaller piece of the overall frame of reference of your lifetime. And because of that, the theory of relativity, if you will, is that as we get older, every day seems to tick by faster and faster and faster. Now, the other obvious thing is that if we're having trouble remembering, if we're having trouble solving problems, if our thought processes are not as sharp as they used to be, we experience that as a symptom of aging, symptom of age-related cognitive decline. So we're pretty confident that one approach to mitigating the problem is to preserve as healthy a stem cell population or reservoir as you possibly can have in order to supply the chemical signals that help support brain function and help support any cellular repair and replacement that goes on in the brain during our lifetime. When I was in medical school a long time ago, the underlying thesis was that the brain is an organ, a tissue that doesn't repair itself, doesn't renew itself, doesn't go through any process of regeneration. There's now evidence that actually goes against that actually says that, in fact, the brain does retain some ability for some degree of regeneration. But it's not just the appearance of new cells in the brain that matters. It's the ability of those cells to interconnect and integrate with the existing complex wiring of the brain. Now, bottom line is that these processes are driven by the chemical mediators that are elaborated by cells, and some of those chemical mediators can be elaborated by a stem population that either is in communication with the living cells of the brain or actually participates in the inner immune system of the brain and helps stimulate the natural renewal and regenerative process that keeps our brains healthy. And so there's a lot of work being done today to better understand the role of regenerative medicine, regenerative cellular medicine, in the long-term stabilization and repair of the brain in order to preserve cognitive performance, high performance cognitive function. So there's another connecting the dots element. We talk about preserving high performance immunity. Now, it's increasingly clear that, like every organ and tissue in our body, the immune system undergoes changes, degrading changes over time. It's a condition we call immunosenescence. Now, immunosenescence is complicated. And by the way, I often say that the immune system is kind of an underrated organ in itself. I was once asked, what's more important, the nervous system or the immune system? And it's interesting. It's a bit of a tough decision to make. The immune system actually, like the brain, has its own form of memory. And so the immune system is educable, like our brain is educable. And the immune system over time morphs and evolves and adapts to give us the best protection against the current threats and any future threats that we may face. Now, high performance immunity means that not only do we respond to infectious threats and we develop an antibody response and a cellular response to those threats, but high performance immunity also means that we produce the right responding cellular elements to injury and disease. And that's a process we know as inflammation. Now, inflammation can go haywire under lots of conditions, and we actually now have scientists creating a terminology called inflammaging, where chronic accumulation of inflammatory mediators and the cells of inflammation are destructive. Over your lifetime, the more chronic the level of inflammation you have in your body, the more destructive it is to your body. And so we have lots of tools today to combat inflammation, but some of those tools, pharmacologic tools, biological agents, and so on, that suppress inflammation by going after a specific molecule in the cascade, although it works and it can improve symptoms, for example, pain, there's a trade-off there. And so one of the thoughts is that if you want to preserve your immune system's ability to create inflammation when necessary, stimulate repair when necessary, do the cleanup when necessary, maybe the younger your immune system in your body is, the better it can do that. Because as we know, inflammation seems to become more chronic and more debilitating as we age. And so treating immunosenescence, addressing the declining immune function with age, I believe, and a lot of the work we're doing is supporting this, I believe can be addressed by restoring immune function, by replacing the older elements of the immune system with younger, less degraded components of the immune system. And by the way, that may be simply by providing access to the stem cells that give rise to the immune cells in your body. And so I think the future may hold great promise for regenerating or renewing your immune system by simply adding new, young stem cells that are capable of producing the immune cells. And that's actually something that we do already clinically in the process of bone marrow transplantation. We know you can take out a defective bone marrow, which makes the immune system, in patients with cancer, for example, just get rid of it. You can ablate the immune system, the bone marrow, and you can replace it with new stem cells, which create a brand new immune system. And so I think that the future may hold that that's an approach that can be used much more generally as a way to restore, renew, and improve the function of our immune system and combat immunosenescence associated with aging. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the fourth component of what I think healthy longevity is all about, which is preserving youthful aesthetics. Now, without it sounding too narcissistic, my feeling about maintaining youthful aesthetics is because every human being, like every organism in our world, lives in a competitive environment, right? As Darwin talked about natural selection, selecting for those characteristics which allow you to compete for survival, those same functions are important in human-to-human interaction. And believe it or not, any 65-year-old executive out there who's worried about the 35-year-old young executive vying for their job knows that this competitive world means you've got to be able to not just be cognitively as sharp and physically as sharp, but you got to look the part as well. And we know the industry around the aesthetics of preserving a youthful form is an enormous industry, and rightly so. And by the way, I don't disregard the importance of all the tools available today to preserve a youthful phenotype, a youthful form. Our dermatology and plastic surgeon colleagues have done a great job helping people preserve as youthful a form as they possibly can, and there's enormous benefits to that. That approach pays dividends. The aesthetics industry, by helping to preserve the quality of our skin and our hair and our nails as we age, is paying big dividends to us in terms of the mental state of the individuals, their ability to compete with their peers, their ability to enjoy their lives and to feel gratified every day. That's an important part of healthy aging as well. And I'm here to say that I believe that the same tools we're using to preserve mobility and cognition and immunity, those same tools can probably apply here too in preserving youthful aesthetics. The best example of that is many of you have seen. You can't go to a high quality aesthetics expert, whether it's a dermatologist or an oral dental surgeon or a plastic surgeon, and not have them talk about the availability of tools like exosomes and even in some cases cellular therapeutics, and in some cases even offering services where they can collect your own stem cells or derivatives thereof and use them to restore the quality of your skin, or help preserve your hair when your hair is you're losing your hair. All of these opportunities are regenerative therapy solutions. They're just using different elements of the regenerative system. And so when I think about all those four pillars of healthy longevity, I don't discount for a moment the importance of preserving youthful aesthetics. And I think the future of that field is going to be to deploy the same types of tools we use in much more serious chronic illnesses and use them to enable your skin, hair, nails, etc., to perform and function as youthful as possible. And I think that is an important component of the overall spectrum of approaches to treating age-related diseases. When I first got interested in stem cells 35 years ago, I got interested because as a guy who was focused on traumatic brain injury and spinal cord injury, and I was looking to find a way to repair the functional damage that was done by those injuries, stem cells emerging on the scientific field motivated me to say, well, is this potentially a toolkit we could use to repair these damaged brains and spinal cords? And all I knew at the time was about the developmental biology that was behind how stem cells function, because they start out as this, undifferentiated primordial form that, when it divides and begins to specialize, creates any of the complicated cells and tissues of the body. Could that be used to fill the defect or the void that exists after a brain injury, after a spinal cord injury? At the time, didn't really fully understand how stem cells or cell therapy might work. Kind of in a almost a rudimentary way, thought that stem cells might just plug the hole. What we know now, after 35 years of working, is that stem cells play a much more complicated role in orchestrating the responses to injury and in orchestrating the repair and regeneration process, usually by elaborating chemicals. They synthesize different molecules that, when released, actually drive the behavior of cells around them. So stem cells can be thought of as a master orchestrator of the repair and recovery response. Now, along the way, having invested lots of time and human capital and tremendous amounts of money being devoted to basic and translational and applied research, we've learned that stem cells can, in fact, be used to in many cases to drive some of the repair and regeneration processes that are resident in us during our lifetime, but begin to either fail or become deficient. So they're not enough to fix us after every injury. You know, when we're young and we get hurt playing basketball or football or whatnot, the repair process that we kind of experience as first pain, right, then soreness, and then over time stiffness and then recovery, that's a process of inflammatory cells coming in, cleaning up the damaged, really defective cells and tissues. And then there's a replacement process where the stem cells resident in those tissues actually repair and renew and regenerate what's been damaged. That process takes place throughout our lifetime, and it's driven by the stem cell population in the body. Knowing that, the logical conclusion one could make is that you need to have a reliable source and pool of these stem cells to do all this. And if your own reservoir of stem cells becomes deficient or defective, replace it or augment it. And that's what drove a lot of the work that I've been focused on for the last 30 some odd years, which is to find a reliable, renewable, high quality source of these cells to be used to augment, replace, or support the reservoir of cells you need to fix yourself after injuries or after disease. So first set of connecting the dots is there's an underlying potential problem with the reservoir of cells you have. The obvious potential solution is to support that, replace it, augment it, and that was one of the original approaches here. So over the last 30, 35 years, as we've been focusing on, okay, we know that cell therapy plays a role in replacing or augmenting your own reservoir of stem cells that are necessary to repair what's damaged and renew what gets old and worn out. We began to understand that there are certain mechanisms that these cells employ to do all of this. Some of those are purely synthetic, that the cells actually have access to the entire genetic recipe that it resides in your DNA and can literally make any of the molecules you need in your body during your lifetime. And so sometimes just the synthesis of those important signaling molecules and growth factors and stimulating factors, maybe just supporting the presence of those in your body is enough to help you deal with injury and disease and so on. That's one possibility. The other is that these cells give rise to other important cell types that have very specific functions in the body. And some of the things that we've discovered at Cellularity and in other research relationships we've had is that newborn stem cells that can be used to create cells of the immune system, things like lymphocytes, things like natural killer cells, can be employed very specifically to address problems that are clearly managed by the presence of healthy forms of those immune cells. So let me explain that. I think we've talked previously about the role of natural killer cells. And natural killer cells are kind of the body's first line of defense. It's part of what we call the innate immune system. And the innate immune system, by definition, is that part of the immune system that's pre-programmed, if you will, to perform very important defense mechanisms, defense functions against the most common threats, things like viral infections, things like cancer, and also, very importantly, to clean up the cells that become irreversibly damaged and become what we call senescent. Well, those natural killer cells also play an important role in just the natural processes following acute inflammation. And so after acute inflammation, natural killer cells play an important cleanup role. And so if you think about it, that's just one avenue that cellular therapy can assist in treating different diseases. And so when we first discovered that the placenta was an ideal source of these natural killer cells, the obvious approach was, okay, can we mass produce these and use them in a very specific therapeutic way to support functions that are either defective or deficient in our lifetime? And so connecting the dots there was, we know the leftovers of a full-term healthy pregnancy, the placenta, is a great source of lots of cells, among which are natural killer cells. And from these natural killer cells, we can create tools to treat viral infections, to treat potentially cancer, and to treat things like age-related senescence. So that's another example of kind of connecting the dots. The other important aspect of this is, as we're getting to be more knowledgeable about how to make large quantities of these cells from the starting material left over in the placenta, those very, very primordial stem cells, it's critical to come up with essentially an industrial plan so that from one source material, you can make lots of cells, and you can drive those cells into different specific mature forms that have therapeutic use. So if you think about it, you start with this organ that's an abundant source of all types of cells, find the cells that can give rise to the blood-forming cells that give rise to the natural killer cells, and then come up with a model where you can mass produce these of high quality and pharmaceutical economics so that it actually fits into the healthcare system. And that's another example of how we have to connect the dots from this discovery of the organ being a source of cells to taking it into a finished form to use clinically and therapeutically. The other thing is that although kind of some of the initial optimism around natural killer cells was to put them in roles that were already well recognized by the medical community and the scientific community, the treatment of cancer, we recognize that cancer is a disease that behaves in a lot of ways similarly to the degenerative processes that accompany old age and accompany exposure to damaging physical forces like radiation and chemicals and viruses and so on. And so, again, an example of connecting the dots, if the same mechanism is responsible for why we diminish in function as we age, and that's a hallmark of aging, is this declining function, and it's associated with a declining pool of stem cells and a declining functionality of things like natural killer cells. The obvious connecting the dots is, well, if I can fix that underlying quantitative defect early on, I might improve the responses to a variety of diseases, not just cancer, but just functional decline with age, diminished capacity to respond to infections, things like that. And so that's another example of sort of connecting the dots and using the tools we have at our disposal to come up with novel and creative therapeutic solutions to different problems.